So there's something I wanted to kind of make as a note before we start. It's not in the slides, but very little of what you're going to see in here is anything that I've built. A lot of what we're going to see is what I've seen other people in the community build. I'm going to try to reflect back to you some of the cool things that I see you doing or that I see us doing, not stuff that I'm doing. So this isn't a talk about me. This is what we as a community can build and the direction that we can take things. And so you'll see cool things in here. This, for instance, is from David Frank. I miss David every day, so that's for him. So what are we doing when we build with Lego? Fundamentally, whether you're building Technic, Galador, Castle, Space, whatever it is, whatever is your jam, what are we doing? We're making models, right? We are doing a project of taking something from our imagination, something from the world, something we've seen, and we're dialing that down to something that we can fit into a display hall, right? So maybe you can't build the entire Sistine Chapel at 1-to-1 scale and take it with you, but maybe you can build it at a small scale and make it into a mock. Or you can take a church that you've seen, or a cathedral that you've seen, or a tree that caught your attention, or whatever it is. So what are we doing? We're taking the key details of that thing that we want to represent, and we're taking the stuff that we think is iconic about it. So maybe if I'm building a cathedral, I've got the spires that I want to, have come through. Maybe I've got the arch for the entryway. Maybe I want to hint at the stained glass, right? Maybe I want to give a sense of Gothic architecture and flying buttresses. How do I dial that down to the scale where I can put it onto, in this case, this was a trophy that I was working on, right? So we choose what to keep, and we choose what to leave out. If I'm taking something the size of a cathedral and taking it down to an 8x8, right, obviously I'm leaving a lot out. So I have to make a decision as to what I'm leaving out. What am I going to keep? What am I going to omit? So I try to pick the iconic curves, angles, shapes, the things that make the silhouette of a building, the things that make it iconic. If it's the Leaning Tower of Pisa, maybe I need to include the lean, right? Kind of makes sense. If I'm building a tree, I want it to look organic. If I'm building a building, I want it to look majestic. But I'm trying to figure out what are the key details that I want in and that I want to leave out. And I'm doing substitution. Maybe I can't produce the exact curve of something with the elements that I have. Can I get it close enough? Can I substitute multiple angles that change over the course of something to represent a curve? And if you stand back far enough, it looks like a curve, right? So, and I'm taking the colors of that thing and I'm reducing them down to the palette of colors that I have available in Lego Element. Now, that palette is getting better and better all the time. So the amount of reduction that you have to do is not nearly like it was 20 years ago, which is nice. And I'm taking physical phenomena. Water. Well, I'm not going to put real water in my mock. I know actually somebody did that in the hall this year. It's kind of cool. He's got a fountain that really works, but I'm not going to do that. I can't be sloshing stuff around in my car. So how can I represent water? How can I represent energy? How can I represent fire, flame, cold, or motion, right? So where do we start? We all start with the sets that we got as a kid, the thing that was under the Christmas tree, the thing that was in our stocking. We start building with what Lego gave us. And depending on what era you came into the hobby, you might have started with some stuff that was a little sparse. Not going to lie. But it has improved a lot. The sets that you can get these days have a lot more detail than they did, a lot more architectural details, a lot more landscaping details. But even still, it leaves a little to be desired. So what do? We go to magazines, we go online, we see what other people are doing. Maybe I pick up my favorite, whether it's Brick Journal or Histobricks or I go to TBB or, Brickset. I look at what other people are doing. There's a natural amount of, you can call it copying, you can call it ripping people off, you can call it creatively adapting, you can call it just learning from what other people are doing. But it's what we all do. We all see what other people are doing and we all reflect it in our own builds. And the progress can be a little slow. It takes somebody, reinventing things or coming up with a new idea before things really change very much. So what we end up with is kind of a design language that can be a little bit shorthanded, and we all tend to do kind of the same techniques. We all tend to build the same road base plate or the same pattern or the same tree. So what I'm hoping to do is to shake that up a little bit. So, grass is always green, wood is always brown, rock is always gray. Can we do better than that? I mean, for instance, if we make the conscious choice to use other colors in the palette or other elements or to do different things, can we do a little better than just a green base plate with a few grass pieces stuck on it, or a tan base plate with a few, kind of tumbleweeds drifting through? I think we can. And the first way that we do that is to challenge our expectation. Do you think that grass is always green or always flat? Do you think that wood is always brown or even tan? Do you think the stone is always gray, light gray or dark gray, the two things that we have in Lego? I think there's a lot more out there. Do you think the water is always blue? It's really not, right? Do you think the sky is always blue? I mean, especially, when we get the summers that we've had lately with all the ash in the air, it's definitely not blue. So you get the picture, right? There's a lot more that we can do. And I propose that if we're trying to do things that we want to be believable, let's go for what's believable. Let's intentionally choose things from the palette of elements and colors that are going to give us the look that we're going after. On the other hand, if we want to do something that's over the top, that's superheroes and all bright colors, let's do that. If you want to make something that looks like it's straight out of the pages of a comic book, use those bright colors, go for it, but be intentional about it. Pick what you want your palette to be and what you're trying to express. And when it comes to specifically, if we want to do what we believe to be kind of realistic landscaping, which is kind of what I'm here to talk about, there's lots of folks who can give you great talks on building stuff that's comic and cool. So if we want to do what we think is going to make for good landscaping, then we look at nature, and nature tends to avoid very obvious patterns. You don't tend to see lots of straight lines. You don't see things in nice square boxes, right? We tend to build on base plates, which lends us to, build the world on 32 by 32 increments. But I guarantee you that that's not how nature is if you go and walk around it, unless man's influenced it. I mean, water is very rarely ever fixed or stationary, and not for very long. If it's stationary, that's typically an unstable equilibrium that is going to get disturbed by the first wind, the first thing moving through it. It's always flowing, it's always moving, it's lapping away at the rock or the wood or the water or whatever it's touching. So how can we give the notion of some undulation, some waves, the water actually moving, right? Plants are not the same. Two trees of the exact same species growing at the exact same time on the same plot of land are not identical, right? No two trees are going to be the same. Some of them have suffered disease or rot, or one of them's had a woodpecker peck through it, or one of them has, less rich soil that it's sitting in, or less access to water, right? So how can we create texture in our plants, our trees, whatever it is that we're depicting? How can we make them look different one to another, different species to species, right? So if I want to have a forest that has 2 or 3 different kinds of trees, how can I make them look like something other than just same tree, different color, same tree, different color? This is my green tree, this is my lime tree, this is my olive tree, right? Can we do better than that? And it's easy to think that this might require a lot of radical techniques, a lot of crazy new elements or crazy new building techniques, or we need to go snot everywhere. Even simple choices like using using slopes instead of tiles or plates for grass can give the notion of this being windswept coming off the beach. Just that simple technique of using those cheese wedges for the olive grass there gives this whole notion of that build, this sense of motion and wind coming in off the coast. Simple technique, very effective. Not everything that we're talking about has to be radical. So rocks, I think, have stories to tell. I mean, at the risk of sounding a little like Bob Ross here and talking about our happy trees and our happy rocks, But, rocks have been through some stuff. A rock that's been tumbled in a river is going to be rounded. Something that was cleft right off of a piece of shale is going to be sharp and jagged, right? How did the rock that you're building end up where it ended up? What's the history of this thing? And I don't necessarily mean going all the way back to geographic times, but think for a minute about, okay, what type of rock is this? How did it get here? What is it doing here? Has it been weathered? Is it part of some formation? Are there a couple of different striations in your rock layer? That can be a cool effect. Maybe mix some sand red in one layer, then a tan layer, then a nougat layer, right? So a couple of examples here. Note the striation in the rock in this thing, where you've got the kind of darker at the bottom, lighter at the top. Same technique to make the shapes, because all of that rock face was weathered by the same water together, but different color. Meanwhile, the castle sitting on top of it would have been built out of individual pieces of rock, probably which came out of that same formation or something very nearby. But look at all the different shapes of the different stones in the bricks, the colors. Now you break up the big gray wall syndrome and you've got something kind of interesting going on. Nothing radical here. We're not talking about crazy studs out or, it's a little more parts intensive to build out of plates than it is in bricks. Doesn't go together quite as quickly, but look at the effect. So even something as simple as lowly old dirt. Dirt can actually be interesting. Dirt and sand. If you're building a beach, you got a lot of sand to think about. That's a big part of your build. Is it wet sand? Is it dry sand? Is it all made of one thing? Is it potentially made of multiple different things? Right? And, wet sand is probably going to be darker looking than dry sand. It's probably going to be flatter and more packed, whereas lighter sand is going to form dunes. Are the rocks showing through? Even just snow. Snow does all sorts of crazy, cool, interesting things. I mean, as a skier, I love spending a lot of time on the chairlift, looking down over all the snow and seeing how it drifts and forms. And it's not always white. I mean, it can be blue if it's coming off of a glacier. If you've ever seen some of the Alaskan glaciers have bacteria on them that make it red. Snow's not always just white and it's not always flat. Forests are not just, here's my tree with green leaves, here's my tree with green leaves, here's my tree with green leaves, forest done, right? There's a lot of stuff going on in a forest. You can have leaf litter, you could have ferns, you could have rocks, you could have, critters running around or habitats or birds or nests, right? And whatever nature you're depicting, it's very rarely ever just flat ground. And of course, again, because we tend to build on base plates and we have limited parts, we tend to build things relatively flat. And sometimes you end up with reasons why you kind of have to do that, because I need to mate up with somebody else's part of a build. And so I can't go nuts making my section 5 bricks tall if the other person's section is 1. But in those cases where we've got it available to us, maybe we change it up a little bit, right? We could have, precarious rock faces, creeks and streams that drift through, right? Think about contour. And I mentioned creatures, but this is one of my favorite things. I love to have little drop-in creatures in a build. I mean, even if it's a battle scene, I might have a seagull. Like our Ukraine build has 2 seagulls in it, Or you might have elves tromping through a wood, and they might have all sorts of woodland creatures greeting them because they're friends with the elves, right? You might have a desolate dock scene, but maybe you've got the one crab skittering by on the beachfront. I mean, just those little things can make for cool details. And if you put a creature front and center, it's going to grab the attention and it's part of the scene. If you kind of drop it in as a little hidden thing, it's that little visual prize for somebody who's scrutinized your build, right? If you put something that's non-obvious, the kid who sees it is going to go, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, look at the otter," right? Maybe you hid that in there specifically for that kid to find. The other thing is, nature is never one thing for very long or very far. Forests give way to grasslands. Grasslands give way to beaches or deserts or savanna or, so think about transitions. Think about where different biomes collide or meet one another. Think about a clearing in the middle of a forest or a glade in the middle of a grassland. Think about, maybe part of a beach is very sandy, but another part of it's very rocky, right? Think about transitions and where we can put these things together and do cool things. Okay, so by this point, this has been a lot of theory. I know you're all builders. You're like, can we get on with this already? Can we build some stuff? I'm getting there. But let's plan. So when I'm planning a build, here are a few of the things that I like to kind of go through. How big is it going to be? Am I building on base plates or just plates? Because that's going to have influence on how things made up. And if I'm building on base plates, that's going to kind of lock me into certain sizes and footprints. If I want to be able to do something more freeform, maybe I want to just build on plates. What about the connections between sections? Am I building something that needs to be in multiple modules that go together? And are there other people's modules that I need to interface with? We should plan that out. I tend to have this thing, I'll show you in a second, where I have a certain kind of pattern that I do for how I connect things. But as far as structure, if I'm building up, how am I going to do that? How am I going to build height? Am I going to use supports that end up being hidden behind something? Am I going to use the Duplo route of using Duplo for kind of the base structure and then brick over it? I need to kind of think through some of that stuff. So a lot of times what I will do, if I know that I'm going to build multiple modules that need to go together, I will use 1x2 Technic bricks with a Technic hole in them, and then behind that, a 1x2 with the axle connector in it. And what this allows me to do is to mate up these sections with a 4-length axle and slide the pieces together. I don't know if you've ever tried putting modules together that have Technic pins. If you have more than about 4 Technic pins that you're trying to connect, you are in a world of hurt. And if you have multiple modules that do that, that world of hurt gets exponentially worse for every module. I don't recommend it. But with this, without a lot of trying to push and overcome that initial friction to get that pin to pop, with an axle, you just slide them together. When you're done, you slide them apart. I've heard this called a Wayne joint before. I think Wayne came up with this long before I did. I came up with it independently, but I think this is something that Wayne's been doing. So credit where credit's due, not trying to steal anybody's thunder. So, are you going to light your build? Whole other set of things to think about. Where are you going to run cords? Where are you going to run battery cables? Where are you going to put battery pack? If you're going to run it for a 4-day show, even if you're only running for 2 days for the public, you're going to need batteries replaced. You're probably not going to be able to run one set of batteries for an entire 2-day show, right? How are you going to get your battery pack? And where are you going to run everything to make that work? Another thing that I think benefits people to think about up front is viewing angle. Are you building something to be looked at a show? Is it one show? Is it going to travel? Is it going to go to different shows? Is it potentially going to be set up in different positions or next to different people's stuff from one show to another? Am I building it to be able to be picked up and actually looked at and held? That's going to change how I'm going to focus where I put my detail. If I'm only expecting something to be looked at from one side, I might go crazy rainbow, kooky colors, and kooky connections on the backside, knowing that nobody's looking at that. But if I expect you to be able to pick this thing up and interact with it, well, I can't cheat, right? I need to be able to make the thing 360. And then once you've figured out some of those things, think like an artist and think about how you want to compose the scene. Not just physically build it, but composition-wise. Whether it's rule of thirds, whether you have some particular feng shui ethos that you're trying to depict. How do you want the viewer to experience what you're showing them from whatever angle you're presenting it to them, right? And I also tend to think about layering, especially for things where I'm going to have like water or anything translucent or clear that's going to show through. So I will actually go to obsessive detail to put in layers of, mud and stone and all that type of stuff because I know that it's going to show through in the final product. So I think about things like the bedrock, the contour, the soils, the sediments. So for instance, I was building a river section. I'm going to show this in a minute. And I knew that I was going to have tile over some of this. I knew that some of it was going to end up being covered, but it didn't hurt me to just throw a few plates down that I wanted to be in kind of the right colors. And I wanted the center of the river to look like it was more kind of that rich soil that's been kind of washing through and kind of looks darker. So I layered it that way, such that when I covered it, a lot of that, and I didn't get a top-down view of this particular module, which is unfortunate, but when I picked this module up and look down on it, I can actually see into there and see the different layers of color and the soil and sediment showing back up through it. So this one, I wanted to do kind of a goat path or a cart track for a medieval build. So I wanted it to look like something that was kind of a dusty, dirty path, but it had cart holes kind of worn into it over years of carts passing over it. So in this case, I wanted the brown to kind of suggest where the cart path was, the cart wheels, the actual wheel tracks were, and the tan to kind of be an offset from that to look more like sand or just kind of regular old dirt. Now, I don't think that they're both 100% successful. These were kind of some of my first efforts at trying to do modular terrain. In particular, I don't think that the rutting on, is that going to go, will that go back? Yeah. I don't think that the ruts are really deep enough to kind of sell the whole idea. And I think the dark tan is a little too predominant. So, lesson learned, there are things I can do differently, but it was kind of a first attempt. It's also a little annoying that if I look at across that entire section, that road is just dead flat. It wanders laterally, but it doesn't go up and down very much. So something I would do different. Okay, so what about maybe some ruins that are long abandoned, have been well weathered, and are now covered in snow? This is one of those things that gives the sense of there's some ancient history here, and you can be intrigued by, well, who put that wall there? What was that wall doing? What was that, what happened to it? How did it get knocked down, right? And then I've got the snow kind of drifting up around it. If you think about how snow flows, like how the wind blows it and where it tends to kind of gather and form drifts. So a few concrete recommendations now, getting into some more specific building. Do break up patterns. If you find yourself wanting to put the same type of tree over and over and over again, or the same type of grass, or to build something in a big block, try to shake yourself out of it. See if you can break it up a little bit. Mix up the colors, mix up the textures, mix up the type of plant or the thing that you're doing. If you're putting down rocks, get a handful of different rock pieces and put them down without looking at them while you're watching TV. Just force yourself to pick up the next piece and find a home for it. Make yourself do things that will force you to break up that pattern. Do break up the flatness and sameness of a build. So if you look here, you've got the beach is broken up, looking like it's probably sand over some uneven rock, right? It's not just completely smooth beach sand. You've got the breaking up of the bricks in the tower. It's not just the same color all the way up. It's not the same shape all the way up. There's some really nice changing up of the sameness in this build. And even the path, right? Yes, it's all done with tile, but it's not just here's a tile, here's a tile, here's a tile, perfectly flat path, right? It looks like it's a bit worn. Do break up straight lines. And this is one that even like I say, I still find myself critiquing my own builds for this. If you have something that's running straight through your build, straight at the camera, or straight at the viewer, I challenge you to do something interesting with that, and I think you'll be pleased with the result. So here, this waterfall could have just come straight into the shot, would have been fine. But by turning it at kind of a jaunty angle, so much more interesting. So much more visual interest just by doing that. Do use height. Selectively. Think about where you want height. Canopy of a tree, a high canopy, right? And you could have action going on underneath it. Or a high canopy to obscure something that maybe you want to be a little bit hidden, or you want to be kind of a big reveal in a later scene or from a certain angle, right? Think about sight lines. Think about where someone is going to see your build from. And maybe over the course of walking around your build around a corner, the first time they look at it, they don't see the big bad guy, or they don't see the fight about to happen, or the thing about to jump out, or the creature. But by the time they get partway around it, They get a different view through those trees or around some rocks, and all of a sudden, the big bad is right there for them to see, right? You can create these cool moments just as people observe your static scene. Do fit the things that man creates into the nature that already existed there. I guarantee you we weren't the first folks on this planet. Any place that we've built something, there was some pre-existing land, terrain, rocks, dirt, mud, grass, trees, shoreline, something. What existed first? And then how did somebody build their way into that? Do think about what your water is doing. What is it flowing over? What's mixed into it? What's under it? What's on top of it? What's being carried by it? What's being pushed by it? What's being worn down by it or has been worn down by it, and for how long, right? So here, we've got a pretty gnarly battle scene, and some of those helmets just sitting there really suggest that some bad stuff's gone down, right? Simple technique, a lot of story being told there. Do embrace bright colors where it makes sense. We've got all these really cool bright yellows and oranges and that type of stuff. They can be very, very stark. If you do that on purpose, it's cool. If you just do it because you couldn't think of a better idea than to just build all of your trees out of the same color of yellow, it's kind of same, right? But when you use bright colors selectively and you have a purpose behind it, very cool effect. Do embrace studs out where it makes sense. I've made a big deal throughout all of this saying, I'm not insisting that everybody go nuts on all the studs out or crazy techniques. But if you use it selectively, it can be a very cool change up. And so the rock face here has this very faceted kind of look from the studs out technique to build it. And do think very seriously about putting things off center, asymmetry, right? Not just making everything completely symmetrical. Do unexpected things. Use things that somebody wouldn't necessarily expect as grass. I would not have expected dark orange grass pieces. And dark orange and olive never would have occurred to me before I saw this build. Now I'm thinking it's genius. That tree technique, I still don't know exactly how to do it, but I want to figure it out. It's rad. And it's so sloped over. And if you look in nature, you'll see trees that they've seen some years, and they've seen some bending to get the sun because it's the only way they could. I would say don't let detail become clutter. And this is another thing that we can all do. It's easy if you're just throwing down the same leaf piece or the same grass piece. You put down 1,000 of them, and all of a sudden it's just kind of meh, right? It's just kind of same. So by virtue of having the troops on one side being red against the stark green, that creates contrast. It makes it easier to see them. And meanwhile, the troops on the other side kind of being more in green means that they probably wanted to blend. That might have been part of their ethos, part of what they were trying to do, right? But you can kind of decide which of those do you want. Do I want my troops to blend in? Do I want my people to blend in? Do I want a particular character to jump out? And then a few of these are just some of my kind of absolute favorites of scenes of various people doing cool landscaping. Just things that I've seen from Flickr, shows I've been to. And what I tend to notice is they have a lot of variety, different types of flowers, plants, trees, shrubs, rocks. Now, in the case of a train layout, you're very restricted as to how much height undulation you can have because that tends to make it very hard for the train to actually be able to go up and down. So there are going to be limits there. But, look at all the cool things going on as far as the flowers, the different kinds of trees. You've got water that flows through the scene. Here's another example of contrast. What is the biggest amount of red that you see in the whole scene? It's the one guy. Now you immediately raise the question of what is that guy? What is he doing? Are those his people? It looks like they might have similar colors to his. Maybe that's the leader inspiring his troops to battle. On the other hand, maybe he's on his own, in which case he's got a problem, right? But I want to know what's going on in that scene. Like that guy standing alone there, immediately draws me into that. I want to understand what's happening. I'm immediately visually engaged in a way that I wouldn't be if everything just blended together. If I couldn't see that one guy standing by himself, I don't get that he's an important character. So, we'll take questions here, and then I want to save a couple of minutes because I've got a little bit of an appendix with how I think we can use colors in the Lego color palette.
Okay, got 2 virtual questions for you here, Sean.
Okay.
First one from Elam. You mentioned that you think of the terrain before the buildings were put up. When are you building? When you were building, do you build the terrain first and then build on top of that like is done in the real world, even excavating to make it look realer?
That's a good question. And it depends from project to project. So if I'm trying to do an entire new scene, I will try to think about the terrain, the buildings, all of it collectively and holistically. And I'll try to, as I'm building the terrain, think about where I'm going to leave the footprint for a building. So if I know, for instance, that I'm building a seaside villa, and I know that I'm going to place a building, roughly here, I'll leave a kind of a flattened out area, probably not perfectly flat, but I'll leave some sort of a flattened out area where that villa is going to go, and I'll build a lot of the rock around it. But I might actually start working on the villa in parallel with the rock, and I might kind of bounce back and forth between them to make them made up and marry up in a way that looks believable. In other cases, if I'm working on something in a collaborative build with a lot of other people, and I'm taking, for instance, modules that I've built ahead of time, terrain that I've built ahead of time, buildings that I've built ahead of time, trees that are coming out of a box already made, in those cases, we'll try to talk about what flow of terrain is going to make the most sense, and then how we can put the trees on it or the buildings on it to kind of go. But it definitely varies from project to project. I don't think there's any one size fits all answer.
Okay, second online question from Beth. Do you have any recommendations for designers that have tree instructions, like trees for a city that can be modified or borrowed? And the comment is that Lego design trees are all too short.
Yes. I have found a few techniques for building trees that I like, just sort of by trial and error and by seeing what other people do and by trying to observe things in nature. I mean, the other day I was driving through my neighborhood and I noticed that there's a particular type of tree that's very prevalent where I live in Redmond that has kind of a predominance of branches that all come out and go up. It's not really one central trunk. It's like multiple different kind of smaller trunks that tend to go up. And I filed that away in memory for later. And then when I was sitting down to build trees for the build that we have displayed right now, that popped back into mind, and I tried to figure out a way to do that. But a lot of what I find for building trees to make them more interesting and to get them away from the very simple, here's my 2x2 brick, here's my leaf elements, here's my 2x2 brick, here's my leaf elements, here's, lather, rinse, repeat. I try to do a lot of use of flex tube. So if you find long lengths of gray flex tube or brown flex tube, and you can put leaf elements off of that, you can put round bricks off of that, you can kind of go nuts and make things as big as you can actually get a trunk to support. That's a fun way to do it. But there are a lot of folks now doing really cool trees with Travis bricks and grass elements stuck out of them to be very pointy. If you look on our Ukraine build, you'll see several that Pat made that are kind of like that. I don't think there's any one tree technique, but if you look online, if you look on Instagram, if you look on Flickr, if you look, where folks gather that have, communities of builders, you'll see lots of folks doing really cool trees in different ways.
So my question is more about cities specifically.
Okay.
I'm currently working on a city in my garage, and right now it just looks very grid-like.
Mm-hmm.
What can I do to avoid that? Make it feel more less like a gridded city and more like a...
What I would think is, think about what the terrain looked like before that city was there. Think about the history of how that city developed. So for instance, Seattle was kind of put in around a series of hills, right? And a lot of waterfront. Then they went and did this Denny regrade project to move a ridiculous amount of earth and basically flattened entire hills to make more, kind of space. But as a result of some of that development, and as a result of the way that the waterfront sat versus like a north-south grid, you actually end up with some set of streets near the waterfront that are kind of on one grid, and some set of streets that are kind of on a north-south grid, and where they come together, the angles are just gnarly, right? Cities tend to be set out on a grid where it's convenient, where the land is flat, but they also tend to work around the places where you have hills and water and lakes and that type of stuff. So if you want to break up the, really simple grid pattern, I would say think about what kind of terrain might have been there that they might have had to build around. If you just take a road and do some weird jaunt in it for no reason, people are just going to wonder why you did that. But if you have a big section of a hilltop or a mountain or a monument or a park and the road diverts around it, people will understand that because that's what we really do, right? So I would think about what could you put in there to create some visual interest that would have forced the roads or the grid to work around it, and your grid will naturally break itself up.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Do you have any others? If not, I'm going to go to the as promised appendix. Yeah.
I'm playing a little devil's advocate here.
Sure.
Is there a line between appropriate variation in something like tree and its different designs and going too far with that to where now you've built a tree that doesn't feel like it actually fits into the rest of your design and your style?
Yeah. I think any element that you're putting into a build, you have to think a little bit about how many times is that element or something like it going to be present. And what I mean by that is, if I'm going to have one tree that's a centerpiece, I can go nuts, lavishing detail on that tree. I can make it super weird, super gnarly. It can be, funny shape. And I had that build earlier where there was just a small group of characters going under a tree at a very jaunty angle, right? If I'm going to have 5 trees in a scene or 10 trees in a scene, well, now I have to think a little bit more about, okay, well, what variety of tree are they? How do they grow? What's sort of normal for them, quote unquote? And I might have some that vary from that, but I don't want them to be completely unrecognizable one to another, or else they're not going to look like the same species, right? Now, if I think I have maybe a whole forest, a forest doesn't typically have more than about 3 or 4 varieties of trees that are growing together in any one concentrated area, unless they were planted by people. But generally speaking, you'll find, the same sets of trees kind of populate, send out their seeds, and grow in certain areas. So then what I'm going to look to do is I'm going to look to have different species that differentiate themselves, different varieties of trees. But again, I don't necessarily want any single one to look so weird that it's kind of out of place, unless I want that to be a focal point. And what it comes down to is, any time that I'm taking something that I'm varying from the others around it, I'm doing that selectively because I want to draw your eye to it, because I want it to be a point of visual interest. If I want that thing to more or less get out of the way and just be part of the background, then I'm going to make them all more similar so that no single one looks very outstanding. I'm sorry. Does that make sense? So here's kind of some thoughts on what we can do with the palette of colors that we have now. And I've had to amend this because LEGO's been generous in giving us some very cool new colors the last 5 or 10 years. Yeah, we can still do dark gray for stone. Yes, we can still do light gray for stone. That's not ever changing. I'm not against that. I'm not a radical. But we can do other things. We can use dark tan plate for moist sand, or wet beach sand. We can use, tan and dark tan for sandstone, for accents, for stone in arid climates, for uneven sand or dunes. We can use brown plate for dirt. Not against it. It's going to be around. It's fine. We can use tile, though, in places where mud has actually been flattened out, right? Mud tends to look a little different than dirt. We can use dark brown for instances where we've got really fertile soil, something that's been, cultivated and plowed, right? We can use dark orange and sand red for clay. I mean, as somebody who came from Oklahoma, I know me some clay. I used to have to, like, anytime we did yard work, we had to dig through that stuff. It was mean. We can use dark orange, nougat, dark tan, tan. Like, if you've ever seen pictures of, you know, the Arizona desert or the Grand Canyon, New Mexico, when they talk about the painted desert, it's not all just tan, people. They wouldn't call it the painted desert if it were all tan. You got purples, you got pinks, you got nougats. Like, there's cool stuff going on there. Sure, we can still do green and dark green. Totally fine. It's totally there. But we've got bright green now. We've got sand green now. We've got olive now. You know, and you take a little bit of green and sand green together and mix that on a tree, and you can create the difference between new leaves and new growth, you know, versus older leaves and older growth. Or, you know, certain like shrubs and grasses, the new leaves might be a bright lime, and they might mature to, you know, a yellow. Like I've got laurel bushes that mature to a yellow, right? And, you know, you can use bright orange, orange, dark red, dark red if you're doing fall colors, right? Go nuts. There's cool stuff to be done now. Yeah, we can still use white plate, tile, slopes for snow. Sure, nothing wrong with that. I tend to use white plate for snow if it's been tracked up, if I want to give the idea that like people have been walking over it, you know, if it's not just newly fallen. That contrast of studs being present or not can be a really cool differentiating factor, even in a section of otherwise just snow. But you can also do some light aqua, some medium blue, some azure, right? You can throw some translucency in there to show places where the snow is melting and it's kind of slushy, or there's a river that undercuts it, right? You know, you can do even darker blues, you know, when you start getting into streams or that type of thing. You can use really darks when you get into ocean water. You can use, you know, greens or translucent greens for algae, right? If you have some water that's kind of sitting stagnant. So those are kind of my thoughts on what we can do to mix things up a little bit and get past the simple kind of primary Lego colors of, you know, brown, green, tan, gray. All right. Thank you, everybody.